welcome. This is the lecture on color, or rather color part 2 for Unit 9. And remember when I had the first lecture on color, I said that that was color, the basics, and that there would be a second lecture on color. And so this is color, the more advanced stuff. And I thought that now would be a good unit to cover color because what with the illustrations that we looked at in the last lecture and some of the impressionist and post-impressionist art that we saw in the art historical lecture for this unit, we're seeing a lot of bold and fun use of color. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about color. And to start off with, we're starting where we started last time, which was with the color wheel. But I want to now say the thing to remember about the color wheel is that it is a lie. The color wheel is an approximation, and it contains some various types of lies contained in it, and there are better models for color besides the color wheel, which we'll be talking about towards the end of this lecture. But the most important thing is to think about all models are approximations of what we see, or of reality. And so don't, the color wheel is quite useful in its own right, but it has some flaws. The biggest flaw with it is that it assumes equal distances between primaries and equal distances between secondaries. And so that leads to some confusion about the relationships that it places an orange in a roughly equal distance between yellow and red. Now, not all color wheels are the same. This is actually, I believe, based off of the Munsell color wheel, which doesn't have the same set of primary colors as the traditional 3 primary, 3 secondary color wheel. But anyway, we'll move on. So some of the things that I want to talk about in terms of color. To start with, I want to talk about ambient color and reflective color. And let's start with reflective color, actually. We've already seen hints of this. We know both these two works quite well. And we've seen the idea that artists in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century were really starting to see that that the color of the thing is not all that there is, that everything changes color based on the color of light shining on it. And so you can, in this particular case, like with this hat, the reflective color coming off the hat and the light coming through the hat changes the color on her skin. That her skin changes not only in value, but in hue and in temperature based on that. Or another good example, we see all kinds of color change going on in the skin here of the dead Christ, but probably the most startling one, once you really notice it, is the reflective color on the edge right there where we're picking up the red from the cloth. And another thing that artists started to note in the 17th and 18th century is that color changed through distance. Just like that there is such a thing as a linear perspective, they also started to realize that there was something that you might call atmospheric perspective, which is that colors tended to seem more saturated and have more contrast when they were up close, and they got less contrasty and less saturated as they moved further away. At first there was not necessarily a clear understanding of how this works, but artists started to figure out the basic premise that every day has kind of an atmosphere, and that color of that atmosphere is this kind of, where, let's say on this particular day, it's kind of a faint blue-gray color that represents the most distant space, and then all the colors are receding towards that, meaning the further and further away they get, the more they have of that color, both in their lights and in their darks. So the darks get lighter and the lights get lighter, and the difference between colors gets less and less, and all the colors get cooler and less intense as they go further into the distance. We can see that even more clearly here in this painting by Constable, where there's all the space created by the change of contrast and by the atmosphere. And so really starting to understand that, and to understand that all color is defined by the color of light and by the atmosphere that you're seeing the light in. And so it's not so much an issue of, when you look at this spot of color right there, that's not what color is that hill, right? It's what color are we seeing right there. And why are we seeing that color? We're seeing it because of the conditions, right? And that's really also true here, right? That is not so much the color of that haystack, it's the color we see of that haystack at that moment. Just as much as this isn't really the color of that water, any more than that is the color of that water, right? They are all just colors of the moment, of the conditions, of the light and the atmosphere. I do love Heed, great American painter, and you can really see a deep understanding of atmosphere and of ambient color. Here's a great example by George Inness, another great American painter, and you can really feel the deep distance and how much the atmosphere is a part of that distance, right? And how much the atmosphere shifts and changes the color. These hills here they're not any lighter than these hills here, or any less green or less brownish in places, or less varied in color, but they look all those things, right? They look pale and less intense in color and less varied in color because of the atmosphere. Here are two more Inness paintings. I grew up not far from Montclair, very near where George Inness spent most of his life painting, and I'm a huge George Inness fan. And so, in terms of ambient color, there's probably no painter who is more of a master of the concept of it, like making painting be a literal explanation of it than Claude Monet. And in these paintings, let's say, of the Rouen Cathedral paintings, he is stating clearly, look, you're never seeing the color of the cathedral. You're always seeing the color of the atmosphere, of the light, of the ambient color, the color of the mood. Here's some more examples. So, but there's more to color than just the importance of ambient color, although that is extremely important. Another complexity is, like I said, the color wheel itself is flawed. That the actual shape of color is a little bit more complex. This is the 1931 chromaticity diagram, and this is a measurement of of light waves that are visible in the human spectrum, based on how intense they get at what values. And there are a couple of things that you might notice about this. One of the things you might notice is that the lightest color is not green, or not yellow. It's actually green, right? And then another thing you might notice is that there's a whole lot of space. Take a look at the rather short distance between, like, straight yellow, which is right there, because after all of these yellows are on the greenish side. Straight yellow right there to red, right? What a small distance that is. And then look at the distance from kind of greenish yellow all the way to greenish blue, right? And you can see it's a much larger area. And this explains something that most art students, after a couple of years of working in color, realize, which is there's so much more variety of colors of green than just about any other color, and yet we think of green as a secondary color. So as painters, you start to realize that green is much more like a fourth primary, and the shape of the chromaticity chart helps to explain why there are so many varieties of colors of green. And Another thing it explains is this strange shape right here. You might notice that